thanks for those of you who have been on time. Let us still wait a little bit for more participants to connect. So again, this is Sébastien Treyer speaking, the director of IDRI. Warm welcome to those who are joining. We're still waiting for 1 or 2 minutes to really formally launch the session. So maybe just to ensure that people are now coming, I will make a few words of welcome. Sébastien Treyer speaking. I'm the director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. We are co-organizing with the Sciences Po EU Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition, this 3 days conference on next generation multilateralism, planetary governance for a sustainable recovery. You are in the specific session that organizers decided to devote to the issue of what is the role of fiction for transformation in a globalized world. The idea of this session came from papers that we saw issued by authors like Amitav Ghosh on this question, and I can just make a short word of transition from the session before, where on the issue of how to ensure that inclusiveness can really function if we want to transform global governance. The chair of the session, Elisa Morgera, was mentioning to what extent it was important to involve not only science but also the arts, because of 2 things that she mentioned. First, the arts are important in order to create experience for decision makers if we want them to really embrace the magnitude of what planetary governance might mean and sustainability transition, but also the arts as a way to access other types of knowledge than scientific knowledge. So you see, I'm not trying to say that this is what you, the grid of analysis that you need to have in mind for the session, just to transition between the former session and this one. I'm really glad that the chair of the session, Pierre Charbonnier, has accepted this kind of difficult task to manage a session with a very large subject, but with 2 eminent panelists that I leave it to you, Pierre, to present. I, from my side, will only say that we're very glad to be able to have you, Pierre. Pierre Charbonnier is a currently very well-known philosopher in France, but not only in France, working, if I make it in my own words, and Pierre, I'm sorry if you need to correct me, but we're really very importantly interested in all the work you do to reconceptualize social progress beyond the links that it had in it with the material abundance for the last decades and centuries. And in that regard, I think the issues of how we can reimagine is, of course, something that is extremely important, reconceptualizing and reimagining. So not an easy task for a philosopher to talk about literature, but there are, of course, many links, and I leave it to you for facilitating the panel. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Sébastien, and welcome everyone to this panel. I'm very happy to take the responsibility of leading the discussion. So welcome, Kenneth Nsah. Hi, and welcome Frédérique Ait-Touati, who will also discuss with us about the role for fiction in the transformation towards sustainability. So, Frédérique, can you hear us, or should we?
Yes, can you see me?
Perfect. Yeah, we can. Okay. So just to give a quick introduction and start our discussion, I think I see three main talking points between the three of us, maybe with the audience today. Well, obviously, the first talking point is the link between literature and climate. And Kenneth, you have written extensively about this topic, both as a writer, as a poet, and as an eco-critic, an analyst of world literature, world nature writing. I don't know if this kind of concept fits you, but we'll see that later. So as Sebastian already told us, and as Amitav Ghosh put it very brilliantly in The Great Derangement, there is an organic link between the process of modernization and the birth of the modern novel. The modern novel is deeply rooted in the genesis of the modern individual, in industrial relations, in the cult of labor or technological progress. And maybe the fact that climate is now a subject of contemporary literature breaks with this history. There is also, I think, a discussion to have around science fiction, because as I see it, science fiction has become a very prominent field where climate issues are metabolized inside contemporary literature. But maybe science fiction is not the only way to deal with climate issue in literature. And as if I'm not wrong, Kenneth, yourself are not a science fiction writer. So maybe that's a talking point also. Well, the second big kind of issues, I think, is the North-South relationship. Because, and there's a link between those two talking points, because if I'm not wrong, the modern nature writing is deeply rooted in the colonial endeavor. In the US, in particular, the cult of the wilderness, the fact that nature has been seen as something that had to be celebrated, is linked to the erasure of Amerindian peoples, has been linked to the fact that white settlers didn't see nature as something that has been previously transformed, dwelled by, so to speak, non-modern or pre-modern societies. So there is a link between climate, literature, and the colonial relationship. So I'd like to know, Kenneth, what's your take, what's your reflection on this very important topic, and how you think about the link between post-colonial literature and eco-critique, nature writing. And maybe the third big talking point is literature as a means of public intervention, literature as a ground to build mobilization, to build new practices, to build new emotional, affective relationship to our environment. And I know this is the kind of concern that is very important to Frédérique as well. So I think we should have dedicate part of our discussion to those topics. So that's it for me. Now I leave the room to you, Kenneth and Frédérique, and I leave you, free to the talking points you consider most relevant to start our discussion. Okay.
Okay. So, who is going first, Frédérique?
Go on. I think the first question is for you.
Oh yeah. So, and it's a very huge question, and I can't pretend to have some kind of very absolute answers to that. But to begin with, I agree with your introductory remarks that there is a huge relationship now between literature and the current global climate or ecological crisis, whichever way we decide to call the crisis, and clarify climate fiction is one of those literary genres that is most predominantly preoccupied by this in its speculative capacity. But I think I am entering this discussion more or less not from the point of Clifford, but from the point of other literary genres that tend to be overlooked when it comes to discussions of the relationship between literature, the arts in general, and the climate crisis. Because other genres like poetry, other genres like drama and theater, or even literary fiction that is not speculative, but more realist in nature, are also speaking to the environmental crisis or to the climate crisis. And yes, especially in post-colonial society, because like you rightly pointed out, when you look at the case of the Congo Basin that I'm working with in my doctoral research, it becomes immediately clear that there are different kinds of forces at play. And this, of course, comes to us through literary representations that we find both pre-colonial, colonial, and neo-colonial forces at play when it comes to the management of the environment, resource extraction, exploitation, and the relationship to nature itself. And also because, like you said, we have also this kind of exported ideas of the celebration of nature, perhaps as in the romanticism or in nature writing in America or wilderness writing, and also especially, and this is crucial for me, the fact that we are talking about the Congo Basin being the second largest tropical rainforest in the world after the Amazon, and one of the areas with the highest concentration of national parks. And the whole idea of the national parks is linked to the Yellowstone Park in America and the racism that came with that. And so today, it is still happening in some other forms, even when we think that the model is changing. It is not changing so much. It's more on paper than in reality, because indigenous people and local communities are often forced to leave these places where they have inhabited for millennia, for years without number, and in the name of conservation. And because we generally, and that kind of conservation has to do, as literature is helping us or illuminating these kind of issues for us, is because also we even have the kind of Cartesian rationality from Europe that made people think that human beings were so special, so supreme, and so different from the rest of nature. But whereas we have people like the indigenous Baka Pygmies in the Congo Basin and other indigenous people around the world, or even African traditional religious beliefs that do not distinguish or create barriers and dichotomies between humans and the rest of nature, but rather remind humanity of being part and parcel of that nature. And so whether it is about the war for resources, like the one that is going on in the Eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we get the minerals for making the batteries for our so celebrated electric cars up north, or coltan for the making of the mobile phones and the laptops that we use. These things are explored in literature. But my only fear, though, is that, however, it seems that most policy makers, the people who are driving policy and the laws and the practices that are expected to be able to help us transition from what the present crisis into more sustainable futures. It seems to me that these policymakers more or less do not listen to literature and the other arts, and we tend to still continue to perpetuate some kind of epistemological hierarchy by putting science up high on the pedal or on the pedestal, and so that what scientists say, because I wonder how many literary scholars, for example, do contribute to this very popular IPCC annual report. And I will end here and hear what Frédérique thinks, and then maybe we'll be doing the back and forth as we discuss both of these issues. And feel free, Pierre, to
Maybe could you give us an example of a piece of literary writing that deals with those issues of the extractive economy, the role of indigenous communities in the context of the Congo basin?
Exactly. Yes, and before I even give in the Congo basin, for people who are familiar with African literatures, for example, the Niger Delta is one of the areas that is super discoursed in research in connection, because it is a place that is very rich in oil, and there is a lot of damage, a lot of environmental damage happening in that part of Africa. And so novels like Oil on Water by Helen Habila, and in the poetry of other poets from there, and even the popular and executed Nigerian activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, he was killed for his activism. He was executed for his activism in order to protect the livelihoods of his local Ogoni people in that delta. And so I just mentioned one of those novels, and then there is this highly anticipated novel coming out soon by Ben Okri, known as Every Leaf a Hallelujah, which is not so much about the oil crisis in the Niger Delta, but about a girl whose mother is sick and she must go to a faraway forest to get a flower, and it's only that flower that can cure her. Okay, I will leave at that. And then coming to the Congo Basin, we take the example of novels like the one that just appeared this year, How Beautiful We Were by Mbolo Mbuwe, which discusses the ravages of an American oil company on a local community in the Anglophone-speaking part of Cameroon, which is even now, as we speak, at war, showing us how the people lived their lives more or less peacefully, and then until when the oil was discovered, and everything turns bitter from there because of the oil spillages on the waters, and then the pollution of water and land, and then how the people have to resist, and then the corruption that goes with that. And now, if we come to the Congo Basin, again, yeah, an additional one for the Congo Basin, we would take a novel like Congo Inc., Le Testament de Bismarck, by Nkole Jean Bofane from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this is a novel that represents the perpetual war over resources in the Congo, in the Northeastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, and at the same time with a very prevalent climate problem. So it's a realist novel. It's not speculative. It's not, but it is very powerful in the way that it evokes a multiplicity of interconnected problems, which are: one, the neo-colonial quest for raw materials in the Congo among former colonial powers and other industrialized nations that need those raw materials, especially as exemplified through a video game known as Raging War, and then including the newest arrival, which is China, of course, that we know about. And how that trickles down to even social crises, social and environmental injustices, in terms of focusing and zooming in on war victims, people whose villages have been ravaged and nearly everyone is killed, and they have to travel through a forest running away from these militias that are either loyal to one camp or the other in relation to the quest for the resources. And then some of these young people come into the cities and they have no platforms that take care of them, and so they become street children. And one of them strikes a business deal with a Chinese friend who has been abandoned in Congo by his Chinese boss, who brought him into a deal and then later on fled the country, leaving the young man. And so they strike a deal selling what they call eau pure, and by eau pure they really want to say eau pure. So so the issues of branding, greenwashing, how water is harvested in the Congo and called eau pure Suisse before it is sold rapidly. And then also the very presence of climate change, even right from the first chapter of the novel, where this young pygmy, an indigenous young person, is sent by an uncle to harvest some insects which they feed on. And he discovers that the insects are almost gone extinct because of human-induced climate change that is happening there, and to even the politics of taking a former warlord and appointing him to head a national park, one of the most popular, the largest national park in Africa, known as the Parc National de la Salonga. And then we have a warlord who is compensated for dropping his arms by being given the park, and then he doesn't seem to have any interest on the park until just when a Chinese map is discovered, a Chinese map of resources in the Congo, including that park, and that is when he starts trying to see if he can capture indigenous knowledges from the people and be able to go there and tap resources, and not to even go there to take care of or to investigate why a tiger, a very old tiger that's been friendly with the indigenous people, has suddenly and mysteriously died. So it's a novel, and I like it. It's a brilliant novel that deals with too many things, but very successfully.
Thank you very much. So, Frédérique?
Yeah.
You want me to react on all that, on the tiger and the no, it's fantastic to listen to you, Kenneth. I want to start by saying that what I can add maybe to the discussion is I'm not a reader of Cli-Fi. I'm a reader of Amitav Ghosh, and I was very, very impressed by like many of us by his very strong thesis and, in a way, accusation towards literature as one of the ways in which actually modernity basically created its own history and its own persona. So what I would like to add is maybe two biased things. The first is that indeed the importance of fiction and narrative in the discussion for me comes from two ways. The first aspect, if you go back to history, is to consider how important some fictional narratives have been for the making of, let's say, our modernity. I just think of one very specific novel or story I want to share with you is The New Atlantis by Francis Bacon. New Atlantis is fascinating because for me it's a kind of Pierre Charbonnier thesis in 20 pages. It's fascinating. It's a way to describe an island and how to control it, how to control completely its resources, and how to relate to the rest of the world, ignoring the rest of the world, but taking out of it. I mean, it's fascinating. When I read it after reading Pierre's book, I was really interested, and I thought, okay, what does that mean? Can we actually take seriously the fact that this fiction, it's a political and scientific utopia, as you know, this fiction was actually the basis of the foundation of the Royal Society 50 years later in 1666. So it's really fascinating to imagine that there is a foundational power of fiction. So that's one thing I wanted to bring to the table, because if we take that seriously, then it really means that indeed, I don't know what would be the equivalent today, but there is something to think in terms of what would be the new foundational fictions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, you want to discuss that maybe first? You want to react to that maybe, but I have a second point I wanted to make. Shall I continue?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah.
The second thing I wanted to say is, today, what I am very interested in is the way in which literary tools, but not only literature, literary tools are actually important in the debate. And again, maybe it comes from my academic trend, I don't know, but I'm very interested in the way in which fiction, you mentioned it, Kenneth, fiction is used in the philosophical writing. Of course, we know that of Donna Haraway, but also of this great ecological thinker, Naomi Oreskes and Conway. You remember this amazing book they wrote almost 10 years ago, The Collapse of Western Civilization. And this is science fiction made by historians of science, trying to alert us. So what they do there is to use the speculative, I go back to your term, Kenneth, the speculative capacity of fiction to imagine the near future. And really it's one very interesting aspect of, again, not literature, but the uses of fiction nowadays in contemporary philosophical discourses. One aspect of it is this capacity to give alert. Very much.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm also very interested, and that's another aspect, because I do distinguish fiction and narrative. I'm very interested in the way in which somebody who works in your university, actually, Kenneth, Anat Singh, this great anthropologist, I'm sure you've been working with her in Aarhus, you know, the way in which she uses narrative as method. And that's really fascinating for me, because here you have an anthropologist making this amazing book, you know, Mushroom at the End of the World. And she said at the beginning of a chapter, look, narrative is a method. Why? Because narrative has a specific power. And again, it's not the same as the speculative power of fiction. It's a power of making stories, meaning in her case, including new actors, new actants, we could say semiotically, sharing times, entering into new timescales, something that Richard Powers, by the way, also does in the other story. Like, how do you suddenly include the timescale of forests, of trees? So basically, I could go on, but I just want to limit myself to those two examples. I mean, three examples of Bacon, Orestes, and Singh, to see how, in a way, beyond literature, literary tools can be extremely effective. Maybe not, I agree with you, Kenneth, politically, I'm not very optimistic on that aspect, but intellectually, in the way in which we reconfigure and we analyze our present time and our changing relationship to the earth in a very concrete and precise way, you know, relationship to the soil, to the rivers, to the resources, and how much narrative is actually important to be able to do that.
Yes, and just to follow up from there, I think one of the questions you asked in passing was like, can we imagine or think about a possible foundational text of today or in today's environmental crisis? For me, I would not say, I would not look at it from like maybe one text, but I would say there are lots of foundational texts, but one of the pioneers of them being Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which has been very fundamental in the emergence of the literary theory known today as eco-criticism, but even in the rest of environmental thought. And then, but of course, we can then begin to add on to that all the texts that are coming out nearly every year, the science fiction, but also the other forms of fiction or the other forms of literature that are grappling with the environmental problems of today. And I actually absolutely agree with you that besides the speculative power, literature also has this potential in terms of making narratives more relatable. So because the narratives, why are other scientists borrowing from literature, especially the narrative aspect of literature, is because there is at least the point that when we tell stories, people tend to relate to them more than to relating to scientific facts. And that is, again, just like, let me just give a good example. You know that obviously people will find it pleasurable reading the novels of Margaret Atwood or Kim Robinson or even Ben O'Cree than reading the hundreds of pages of an IPCC report. Okay, and so because literature also has this capacity that or fiction, that it appeals to our emotions. It can appeal to our emotions, and then, like you said, Frédérique, it also can transcend temporalities and transcend even geographical boundaries, and give voice to otherwise unheard segments of the society, whether they are human or they are non-human. And so on this, for instance, when we look at the way literature has helped today to bring again, or at least to contribute to the debates about if plants are sentient beings or not. Because even as scientific research is beginning to prove more and more that plants do communicate among themselves, that plants have some kind of thinking and so on and so forth, literature is also accompanying that. And because we see narratives from the perspective of trees, we see narratives from the perspectives of other beings. And I think that this is not only fascinating, but important in that it is helping us redefine. Because as we know that this is not only a crisis of carbon dioxide emissions, but also a crisis of the kind of cultural values that we have cultivated for the past centuries. And so by immersing ourselves in such kinds of narratives, I'm sure that in one way or the other, we can be able to redefine our connections and relationships with the rest of nature, with the other beings that cohabit the earth with us. And that is why I'm not surprised that there is beginning to be even more collaboration now between eco-criticism on the one hand and environmental communicators on another hand. Not long ago, there is a volume that came out, I think, by Routledge, an edited volume on eco-criticism and environmental communication, because literature can help us to communicate scientific facts in ways that are more appealing and relatable to people than when they are just presented as facts from science.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would be very happy to enter the discussion with Pierre as well about that. I don't know what you think about it, because
sorry.
I'm very curious. It's just that I must say I wish I could agree with you completely, Kenneth, on this idea that there is a power of art and literature and theater. You know, I just come back from a tour. We were staging Bruno Latour's play yesterday night in Lisbon. You know, so I do believe in that. You know, where otherwise I wouldn't do it, I guess. You know,
yeah.
Performances that try to share new conceptions of the earth, new images, new ways of understanding our Western history, and so it is important in a way. But I must say that I'm always a bit, in fact, desperate in the possible effect of it. So that's why I would be very curious to know what Pierre thinks about it, because he knows better than anybody the history of political thoughts. And is it really possible to go beyond that divide of, as you said, Kenneth, earlier, is supposed to be the serious discourse, you know, the scientific, the rigorous, the philosophical, the social sciences, economy, political discourse? Is it really possible to intervene in that? I don't know. What do you think, Pierre?
Literature can be relevant to the ecological matter. The first is, as you said, Kenneth, right before, that literature can help us to find new words to express the very idea of the crisis. So it's a matter of communication. Maybe it's also, I mean, I always found political slogans around climate issues really poor compared to political slogans that have been developed in the past around the social questions, social issues. So maybe we just need writers and poets to design new words, new expression, a new language to express the very idea of the crisis. The second idea is that literature can help us to imagine scenarios plans for the future. That's, for example, you took the example of Kim Stanley Robinson, the Ministry for the Future. This is a perfect example of how speculative fiction can help us think about the future and think about what we can do when we face well, major catastrophes. And the third would be the one you also mentioned, you both, Frédérique and Ken, the fact that literature can help us to take seriously the fact that non-human beings can be given agency. Probably persons, but agencies that have to be taken seriously. So those are maybe the three modalities through which literature can transform our understanding of the contemporary issues. And so I will follow up with a question for you two. How do you conceive the link between literature and social sciences? Because you mentioned Anat Singh and people writing ethnographic description. So there is already an element of creativity inside the social sciences. But how do you understand the fact that maybe literature goes beyond the narrative elements of social science? And obviously, history is also a very narrative social science. So how do you conceive, well, this relationship between social sciences and creative writing in general?
You want to start, Kenneth?
You can go.
Okay. Go. It's a bit of a, yeah, it's quite difficult for me because again, I think I haven't found yet, but maybe it's because of my ignorance. I haven't found completely inspirational novels, for instance, where I would say, okay, this is it. This is but maybe you can give me some titles, Kenneth, and you can exchange. But again, I think I don't know them. However, I myself, I'm very much into theater and also poetry, and somehow what I try to do or to find is, and it's not a question of hierarchy. Like, it's not. I'm not sure it's about going beyond social sciences, but the matter is really what is the specificity, or what are the specific strengths or forces of the stage, or what is the specific capacity of poetry which social sciences wouldn't have. I think maybe that's the way I would frame the question. And I think you started to answer that aspect, Kenneth, when you said, okay, there is this emotional aspect, and of course we are in a society where the emotional aspect is not supposed to be serious, but the question of affects, political affects, ecological affects, of course, is key to our discussion. So in a way, who else than the artists could take this aspect seriously? So what does that mean to be moved again? And I think then I of course I refer here to the work of Baptiste Morisot very much. He's very interested in okay, what kind of changes do we have to make to our aesthetics in order to include into our affects the other agents, the other natural agents, you mentioned the plants, the animals, but also how to be seriously interested in bacteria, in the soil, and of course there is a question of reorienting our affects. So that's something that could be done in a way, and I'm very curious to know what you think about it, Kenneth, but through poetry, because as we know, poetry is the place of, in a way, the home of those agents, of those actors, of those beings. And it's always been the case. And in a way, theater is also one of the possible sites of for showing the agency of natural beings through, I mean, since the Greek theater, we know how to show the gods of, the gods of the ocean and all that. So there is an interesting discussion for me to have in relation maybe less with the new genre, but also the reconsidering of the old genre, of theatrical genre, of poetic genre. I mean, what do we make of this amazing patrimoine, literary patrimoine, theatrical history, in which the two stages that Pierre again has studied very well, the social and natural stages, they were not divided at some point. And there is something very interesting for me in relation to, okay, how to trace the history of this division, but also how to work with those modes of expressing arts in order to reconfigure or to re-articulate those two scenes. And I wonder, taking seriously Amitav Ghosh's argument that it happened through literature somehow, this exclusion of the natural beings, it could also happen through not only literature but art to re-articulate them. And that's a very exciting program in a way. I don't know what you think of it.
Yes, I think, of course, I would not disagree with Amitav Ghosh, and I also think that, yes, of course, literature usually has this tendency to reflect the spirit of its time. And that is why, of course, we are talking today about fiction and transition to sustainability, because fiction is beginning to reflect the spirit of our time, because we know that one of the most important or prominent global challenges that we have today is the climate crisis. And beyond the other roles of literature or the other contributions of literature that we've already suggested in this discussion, I also think about literature as a tool for sensitization, a tool for raising even awareness on these problems. And also to borrow from Rob Nixon, that literature also helps to shine a light on vulnerable communities, people who feel the injustices of environmental change, of climate change, and who are often overlooked by maybe the media because they are not victims of some spectacular violence, but rather what Rob has called slow violence. So literature helps us at least to deal with these kinds of violences, both the spectacular but also the slow forms of violence. What happens when people die because they have gradually been consuming water polluted by the oil companies, and or because they're consuming food, GMOs and food with cultivated with chemicals and fertilizers and so on and so forth. And then, yeah, and then we also have like the kind of theater I'm dealing with that is mostly used by people who have backgrounds in science, but yet they're writing a theater as a tool for them to send across environmental messages. And of course, poetry, like you said, Frédérique, comes in here as one of the most appropriate genres when we want to speak to questions of affect, to questions of the heart, to questions of emotion. And by extension, or in a sense, fiction, whether it is poetry, whether it is drama, or especially novels, equally helps us in dealing with knowing, or at least distinguishing, because another related problem today, which some call crisis, some don't call a crisis, is the migration in question. And we have know that some people are already migrating today as climate refugees. And how often do we talk about that? But literature also can bring that to the table. And then to end on this, I think that regarding the original question you asked Pierre about social sciences and literature or the arts, I think the environmental humanities, because of its eclectic nature, is giving room now for more and more conversation between the social sciences and other humanities, especially literary studies, and of course, including history, especially environmental history. Environmental historians are doing an amazing job. If you look at the work like the text that Guillaume Leblanc published last year, known as L'invention du colonialisme vert, the invention of green colonialism. That's a foundational text. That's a fundamental text, and from a historian. But it also speaks to us in literature. And then they are also like we are beginning to borrow methods. Apart from the example that you gave earlier on, Frédérique, about Anna Tsing, for example, using narrative, we also have cases where now there is an emerging aspect of eco-critical analysis known as empirical eco-criticism, where we borrow tools from the social sciences in terms of maybe conducting surveys and interviews in order to be able to gauge to what extent people might be able to modify their behavior or to take a certain stand on certain issues after having read some text or watch a given movie and so on and so forth. So I think there is beginning to be some kind of fertile conversation between these disciplines, and I think it has to be encouraged, to say the least.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to take questions from the audience, and I have I take one of them. We already kind of discussed this topic, but the question is interesting. I think we can develop in this. It's from Nsah. How could literature assume the perspective of non-human actors, thus cultivating our understanding of and empathy towards them, while at the same avoiding the pitfalls of anthropomorphizing them? I think it's a very interesting and relevant question, both of you. So,
can you take it again, please?
It's about the I read it again. How could literature assume the perspective of non-human actors and thus cultivating our empathy toward them, while at the same avoiding the pitfalls of anthropomorphizing them?
Mm-hmm. That's a brilliant question. Yeah, and I think there will always be this risk of anthropomorphism. But I would like to look at it from the perspective of one literary scholar here at Aarhus University, Peter Mortensen, who has tried to distinguish between what we could call negative anthropomorphism and then positive anthropomorphism. And I would like to dwell more on the positive aspect, that we can sometimes anthropomorphize, but with good intentions. And especially with this video, because it is absolutely clear and not even debatable that all these agency things we're talking about in literature, it is always humans imagining the perspective of the other. But we still hope and believe that that kind of imagination can help us at least, although we know that we are not absolutely speaking on behalf of those other beings, but we can try to imagine their perspectives, or at least draw people's attentions to imagine in their different ways what those other beings could be doing or saying. And it is very difficult to do that in any language other than the human language, and without risking to maybe transfer some human qualities onto things that are not human. But if we do that in good faith, and I mean by good faith, I don't mean that we are doing that because we want to promote an agenda, an extractivist agenda or a capitalist agenda, but more or less because we want to also point in the direction of the intrinsic value of the other earthly beings with which we share the earth, then I think that it will be considered as some kind of positive or good anthropomorphism. I think that's what I can manage to say, yeah.
I can just try to answer by giving also a little example. One of the things we've been doing with theatrical fiction with Bruno Latour in the recent years is this strange experiment called the Theatre of Negotiation, Make It Work. It was at the Théâtre des Amandiers. And when I look back at it now, I could say that it was a way to test, like really in an experiment, the concepts that Bruno offered of the parliament of things. You know, this idea that he developed in politics of nature, I think. And so, what was the idea? The idea was to take the COP format and to expand it to other beings. So one could react at least in two ways. You could say, oh, this is horrible. This is anthropomorphism at its worst. But if you take, and I like very much, Kenneth, your idea of positive anthropomorphism, if you take the idea that, okay, we actually took the idea of political representation seriously and said, okay, we could do that. We could use the theatrical representation as a way to test an extended political representation. And again, it's a thought experiment. And that's one of the ways in which I would define fiction, at least in our discussion. Fiction can be seen as something very epistemologically strong if it's taken as thought experiments, as it was taken in the 17th century by many philosophers. And in that case, it was a thought experiment in space. And then that's one of the things I just want to bring to the debate, because we didn't really discuss. One of the fascinating questions nowadays, and that again Latour tries to seize, is what is this cosmos we are in? How do we equip ourselves? And it's not only about having new actors, non-human actors on stage, it's also in the way in which we understand the stage, so to speak, if I follow the metaphor. So yes, anthropomorphism is not always a problem, depending, as you said, whether it's actually made with good faith, or at least whether it's made with some kind of care. And the other example, because I have just in front of me, is this example, for instance, you know, this big idea of by Camille de Toledo and others, that it could be interesting to give a legal voice to certain non-human beings, like La Loire, like a river. And again, this could be very, very disputable. How do you say? Yeah, it's very
debatable. Yeah,
debatable. Thank you for helping. Yeah. But again, it's made with a certain methodological attention.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning actually the concept of the rights of nature. I think it's also very important.
And we need fiction for that. And what is fascinating for me with this example of Le Fleuve qui voulait écrire, it really starts like a fiction. It really starts like a not very far from our own thing with Bruno, the threat of negotiation. But it really tries to go towards reality in a way. And I think that was one of the last possible entries of our dialogue. Once you have created a fiction, which is something very classical in law, as we know, les fictions juridiques, once you've built that, how do you lead it somewhere which is more tangible, which is into the political discussion, in how do you bring it to Europe, Parliament? You know, what do you make with it once it's been done?
Thank you both.
And I think that's a very go ahead, Pierre, because I just wanted to say that is a very important question, which brings me back to my original concern, the concern that decision makers and policy makers seem not to be listening to literary scholars and writers, and that we, or at least writers and literary scholars, seem not to be involved or recruited in those areas or in those places where decisions are taken. And that's some kind of food for thought, I guess.
And I just continue on that, and then we let you speak, Pierre. But I think it's hence the importance of alliances. Again, it's very basic what I'm saying, but if you take literature or art as a closed world, then it remains powerless because it was made powerless. And if you start to make alliances, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's important for me to work in Sciences Po and to work with people at IDRI and to discuss with Pierre and philosophers and people who actually do politics.
Yeah,
it's really through alliances that you can start moving things a little.
Yeah, and I think we need to have more people in similar positions like yours. who can get into these research institutions and be able to dialogue with political scientists, social scientists, historians, and politicians themselves, business world, and so on and so forth.
Okay, I'm going to take two questions from the audience. The first is about dystopian fiction. Pierre Duplessis expresses the concern that the popularity of contemporary dystopian fiction could tend to make people accept the idea that it's over, that we are doomed, and that it's becoming the most accepted scenario for the future. So, what's your thinking about it? And the question from Sébastien Trailleur, actually, he would like to know more about the influence of movies and TV series, of visual culture in the relationship between climate issues and the narrative tools we have to think about it. And if we have time, I also have a question, but we'll see that later.
To Pierre's question, yes, that's a very important question because there is this whole debate about whether dystopian fiction and also this trope of the apocalyptic trope that has been used a lot in so much environmental writing, if it is helpful or not. I think that there is beginning to be a tendency now for people to look more in the direction of instead utopian fictions, but also more positive scenarios. But I would still think that there is some value even in a dystopian scenario or text, in the sense that instead of only looking at it as considering climate as a fait accompli, or the climate crisis as a fait accompli, that it also helps us to prepare to live with the unfixable aspects of the crisis. Because one thing is that if we look at climate policy and science, people are talking about not only mitigation, but also adaptation. So we could also read dystopian fiction as being part of preparing our minds to adapt to the changing realities, because we don't know what will be saved, we don't know what will be rescued, or we don't know how much of the crisis will be put under control and how much will not be put under control. And lastly, I think there was a question about film and fiction. Yeah, there is also a lot happening within the area of visual art and even other forms of art, even the fine arts and other forms of art in relation to the climate crisis. And I think that some eco-critics are also working even on that, and more people from other disciplines, in terms of there is even there are even publications like eco-media. And I remember one of my colleagues here in Aarhus University is working on what he calls wastetics, and he's working mainly on the way that waste is explored through film and film, cinema, and other things. And we know about the plastic pollution. That is also one of the offshoots of today's current crisis. So I think documentaries, but also even more speculative films and so on and so forth, are also crucial for the way that we think about and react to the crisis.
Maybe do you have examples of African movies picturing the climate or environmental situation? I
cannot quickly think about any for now, but I know that there are a few short documentaries here and there that deal with environmental issues in the Congo Basin and other parts of Africa. But I will need to do more research to be more specific. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Frédérique?
Yeah, quickly, I absolutely fully agree with you, Kenneth. And I just add a few things for the pleasure of the discussion. First, on the dystopian fiction, one of the things I think we haven't discussed, and I think it's quite interesting to see it as a phenomenon, is what we call sometimes eco-porn. You know, the fact that there is a fascination for the destruction, for catastrophe. So it's not exactly what dystopian fiction is, but it's what it can be sometimes. So, of course, one of the questions more generally that is asked when we ask about the role of literature and the role of fiction is, again, what kind of affect do we want to create? Do we want to nurture this fascination for catastrophe, or do we want to alert? Do we want to adapt? So I like the fact that you mentioned that it can be a positive use through, making our mind see the difficulties, but it can also be very negative. And then on your question, Sébastien, and again a different angle on it, what could be the importance and the role of popular culture, especially series, if I understand well, on our discussion? And again, I want to mention Baptiste Morisot, because he just sent me a text about that. At the moment, we are obviously completely obsessed by ourselves in our series. We are, as Baptiste says, I think he said, anthropomorphism. I love this idea. I think it's a beautiful concept. So what would that mean suddenly to open up our series to other things? Because we are also very interested in other beings. So there is obviously a discussion, but that would be another one now to open up on the role of popular culture in our discussion.
Pierre, I'm sorry, it's just to remind you that we need to go to a close because you also have to teach in the...
Yeah, sorry. That's because of Sciences Po, I'm now a teacher. So, so may I leave you, the three of you? If you maybe want to...
I'm probably going to just to stop the conversation where we was. I'm very sorry for that, but really want to warmly thank the three of you for this immensely useful conversation. And I think we should have had more of literary analysts and artists in the whole conference. But I think at least you see that we take you seriously and not just as a kind of an add-on to the conference. And we are very happy to see that we need to build those alliances that Frédérique was mentioning with philosophers, with historians of literature and science, with writers and literature analysts. So let's take this as an aperitif, as a first starters to really also involve you in what we do at global scale, because a lot of what you've been saying is extremely important to really deconstruct the narratives behind global governance, as Dipesh Chakrabarti also told us on the first day of the conference. Thank you very much to the three of you. It was extremely interesting, and I took notes to really account also for that session in the report that I will make this afternoon.
Thank you, Sébastien. Thank you, Pierre, and nice to meet you, Kenneth.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you and goodbye.